Good day everyone. I am Wawi Torimot Samlamdag from BSed English 2A. So for today's video guys, I will be discussing to you about Renaissance literary criticism. So you hear the word Renaissance guys, what comes up into your mind? Do you have any idea? Alright, thank you. So now, for you to be able to know what is Renaissance and literary criticism, let us first define what is Renaissance. So the term Renaissance of literary criticism is of Italian origin, meaning rebirth or reawakening. It stands for the historical rebirth of literary and cultural movements in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It was a rebirth of education, science, art, literature, music, and better life of people. So, another meaning is the Renaissance was a time of coming out of the dark. Why? Because during the era of Greece and Rome, the literature, the music, the lives of people are being affected during that era. They destroyed everything. So now, we have now a new era, an era of reawakening, an era of rebirth, an era of rediscovery. It called as Renaissance as was a time of coming out of the dark, because during that time there was dark ages, and it refers to rebirth, rediscovery of the values, ethics, and style of classical Greece and Rome. So the movement initially started in Italy and later spread gradually to France, Germany, England, and other countries of Europe. So note that humanism was an important movement during the Renaissance. So when we say humanism, it is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural beliefs. So humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. So basically, humanism prompted the idea that man was the center of his own universe, and people should embrace human achievements in education like literature and classical arts. So that is the focus, or that is the important movement during the Renaissance, is the humanism. So now let's talk about the important points. First point is, one other task was to seek a just and proper answer to Plato's refutation and objections raised in his Republic. So during the Renaissance, many Renaissance scholars successfully answered these charges by blaming the artist and not the art. Those who betrayed arts and betrayed the sacred office of art are oath to be vanished. That is the point number one. Second point is the Renaissance criticism took upon itself the prime duty of uniting and reconciling the best elements in Aristotle and Horace. So this is an important event whereby literary criticism becomes an independent field of study through attaching the best elements of Aristotle and Horace, which is the prime duty is uniting and reconciling. Here are the famous people behind the Renaissance era. They are Petrarch, Scaliger, Minturno, Boccaccio, and the Italian commentators Robertello and Castelvetro. Now, let's talk about the fundamental features of Renaissance literary criticism. Let's first talk about the theory of imitation. So Horace and Longinus use it as a meaning, the imitation of other writers. So basically, it is the one in which it was not often used by the Renaissance critics. So theory of imitation is not often used by the Renaissance critic. Next is the truth, value, and didactic role of literature. So when we say didactic, it refers to the moral instruction, to teach. So the Renaissance critics adopted the Horatian formula that literature should teach and delight. That's the main importance of the literary works or the literature, that readers, as students, will learn from it. As we read particular literature, we learn. And the prevailing version of this is that poetry teaches delightfully. Next is the classical Uniatists. So during this era, the Renaissance writers added the doctrine of the unity of place to Aristotle's original demand for the unity of action and time. So we have an original demand for unity, and that is unity of action and time of Aristotle. Okay, so now we have the unity of action and time and the unity of place. The next is the notion of verisimilitude. So when we say verisimilitude, it is the appearance of being true or real. So during this time, Renaissance critics asserted that poetry must be versimilar in two ways. The first one is must imitate objects that are real, not fantastic. So when you imitate a certain works, you should imitate the real ones and not the fake ones. And another, its manner of imitation must appear probable or at least possible to the audience. The objects or the works that you imitate, it should appear probable or possible to the audience. Next is the use of vernacular. The Renaissance writers were obliged to address controversial issues of meter, rhyming, and versification and vernacular tongue. So when we say vernacular, there's no specific meter. Words that we use every day, that is vernacular. There's no standard. Next fundamental features of Renaissance literary criticism is the definition of poetic genres such as narrative and drama. The Renaissance writers wrote in the ancient forms of genres of epic, tragedy, and comedy to attain the ancient spirit. So during this time, Renaissance writers wrote ancient forms of genres for us to be able that ancient spirit will not be forgotten. It will be preserved again. So that's why they wrote ancient form of genres in epic, tragedy, and comedy. And also they mod their style upon that of the great ancient. Next is the invention of new mixed genres. So during this time, the Renaissance critics did not accept the mixing of genres as tragic comedy. So from tragedy to comedy, they mix it into tragic comedy, since it can affect the sense of decorum. So the Renaissance critics this time did not accept the mixing of genres into tragic comedy, since it can affect the sense of decorum or the sense. So hence, they invent newer, characteristically humanist genres such as essay and dialogue form. This the invention to mix genres. They did not accept the mixing of genres into tragic comedy. Instead, next is the use of rhyme in poetry. Renaissance writers rejected the regular stress-based alliterative, also the unclassical barbarism. Say barbarism, it is an absence of culture and civilization. Thus, they searched for a new metrical basis for poetry and eventually stimulated the growth of blank verse. So when you say blank verse, it is a poetry written with regular, metrical but unrhymed lines, somewhat related to iambic pentameter. So that is the use of rhyme in poetry. The last but not the least fundamental features of Renaissance literary criticism is the relative values of quantitative and qualitative verse. So during this time, the Renaissance writers introduced classical quantitative methods based on length of syllables rather than stress into vernacular language. So they must give importance here the classical quantitative methods based on length of syllables rather than the stress into vernacular language. So that are the 9th fundamental features of Renaissance literary criticism. And now, let's talk about. So I have here some of the literary critics and their works. So here, the greatest and the most important work of this age is of course the Sidney's Apology for Poetry. So that is the important work of this age, which is the Renaissance age. Next is English Renaissance criticism and the various phases of its development. So there are mostly rhetorical studies of literature in the first stage of evolution. Thomas Wilson's Art of Rhetoric, 1553, is probably the first work of criticism in English language. And Roger Ascham's Schoolmaster in 1568 and Richard Tutell's Miscellany in 1559 are two other important works. So the second phase was a period when attention was paid to the metrics and the metrical patterns in poetical composition. So Art of English, the Poesy in 1589 by Richard Pottenham and Discourse of English Poetry in 1586 by Mary Webb are the earliest works. Next is, in the third stage, is a stage of philosophical criticism. Among the most prominent works of apologetic criticism of this period are Sir Philip Sidney's Apology for Poetry in 1583, Thomas Campion's Art of English Poesy in 1602, and Samuel Daniel's Defense of Rhyme in 1605. And the fourth stage belonged to the first half of 17th century, and Ben Jonson, the Elizabethan dramatist, was the important figure during this period. And the last stage which is the fifth stage, opened up a new dimension in English literary criticism. When the French came on the scene, John Dryden, the poet laureate, became the presiding genius of this period. So that is for the fifth stage of the fifth amazing stage of the literary critics and their works. So these all end for my report. I hope you've learned something about where the Renaissance started. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.